All right, let's finish up with the types of scientific questions. And we're going to focus on the two hardest kind of data analytic questions to answer in the medical literature: causal questions and mechanistic questions. Remember our flowchart that was looking at the different types of statistical questions a medical paper might be answering when it collects data. We've already talked about descriptive and exploratory analysis. We've talked about inferential and predictive analysis. And now we're in this lower right-hand corner where we're looking at causal and mechanistic analyses. So remember the questions that we've already answered is they did summarize the data, they reported interpretations of that data, they are trying to quantify whether those interpretations hold in a new population. And now the key crux question for whether it's a causal or mechanistic question is, are they trying to figure out if I change one variable, does it result in a change in another variable? It's not just looking for a relationship between the two, but specifically how, if I change one variable, what happens to the other? Now, the next question you ask is the effect they're looking for an average effect or a deterministic effect? And so if it's an average effect, we're talking about a causal question. Let's use this cartoon example again. We have 18 meeple. They're purple and green meeple. Meeple either have bow ties or they don't. And we've taken a random sample from that population. Now, if we run a study where we can answer a causal question, we might want to be able to infer something about the population, saying, for example, if I take a bow tie wearer and I take off their bow tie, will they change color? And in particular, a causal question will be, if I take their bow tie off, what percentage of the time will they change color and become a purple meeple? And so by looking at the average effect of changing a particular variable on another variable, we're talking about causal inference. Usually to answer causal questions, you have to do something like a randomized control trial. Now, you can also answer these kinds of questions using more appropriate and more difficult statistical techniques, but you have to be really careful if you're not in the context of a controlled trial. That's still the gold standard. So here's an example. Here there's doing a randomized trial of the European Fans in Training, or EuroFit program. So what they're going to do is randomize half of the people to get this training program, and then they're going to have a control group that did not get the training program. And by randomizing, we can say that the only variable that's on average different between the two groups is whether they're in the training program or not. So if there's any change in their sedentary activity, we can infer that that change in their sedentary activity is due primarily to this training program and not to one of these other variables. And in fact, in this comparison that they did, they looked at the number of steps per day at baseline between the two groups, and then they looked at post-program and 12 months afterwards. And what they were able to observe is that the training program did in fact reduce sedentary time, especially right at the completion of the program. And so what they're able to say is, by assigning someone to this training program, on average in the population, they will reduce their sedentary time. Now, it won't necessarily work for every single individual. Some people reduced their sedentary time and some people didn't. But on average, across the whole population, this treatment seems to have an effect. The difference between that and a mechanistic question is whether the effect is deterministic. So deterministic, mechanistic questions are very rarely answered in the medical literature. We wish all the questions could be answered like this, but they hardly ever are. You can imagine all the different characteristics that go into determining whether somebody has a disease and what the etiology and progression of that disease is, whether it's genetics or the environment. So to discover something that's mechanistic, truly mechanistic, is very rare. An example of a mechanistic analysis in our cartoon example would be, imagine we take a sample of meeple and we say, if we take the bow tie off, 100% of the time they change color from green to purple, would be an example of a mechanistic inference. Now, you can imagine how that's a very hard thing to discover, where 100% of the time a particular treatment, say, is effective, or 100% of the time it's not. The most common example you see in the medical literature are things like Mendelian disorders. So for example, if you have a trisomy of chromosome 21, then you're more or less going to have Down syndrome. So this is an example of a paper where they're trying to collect data from mothers, and they're trying to use that to infer whether babies have trisomy 21. If they do have trisomy 21, almost certainly they have Down syndrome, and it can be used to diagnose those individuals. So these are the only rare, occasional cases where you see that you can actually determine a mechanistic relationship. So that concludes all the different types of analyses you'll see in the medical literature. And in the next lecture, we'll cover a couple of the common mistakes that people make when interpreting what types of questions